What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello everyone, welcome back. This is podcast number 6. And last week we talked about these two figures, Cain and Abel, and how these two figures had actual meaning to the Hebrews. And they didn't actually read this as like a simple retelling of history, literal man named Cain, literal man named Abel. They actually saw something a lot more profound about their own journey, about learning to remember where they've been and again, choose not to repeat the same cycles. Because cycles, they're hard to break, and sometimes they take a tremendous amount of time and dedication, grace, energy for ourselves. It takes time to break cycles. So today, we're going to look at this idea of the flood. And remember, Cain chooses to repeat certain mistakes, and again, choosing not to follow the wisdom of experience. And because of this, there's this escalation that happens of violence and just a lot of chaotic things. And so Cain is actually the founder of Babylon. He's the beginning of this very empire, Babylon, which means chaos. So that's what's happening when we continue to choose destructive paths. We begin to look like the thing we chase, and we tend to become the very thing we've spent all our time doing. If you chase chaos, your life is going to be chaotic. And so Cain's people, they begin acting and appearing chaotic, and it continues escalating until it's gotten really bad. And so remember, this is a story about Israel moving into chaos when they choose the wrong path. So let's look at this flood. Because for people who take this story literally, it kind of plays out like this, if we're going to be honest. God gets really angry because people aren't doing what he wants. So he decides not only is he going to make their lifespan shorter, but he's actually going to murder all the inhabitants of the earth, except for like a couple people who can fit on this wooden ark. So think about this now. He's not only going to murder grown animals, baby animals, all these things, animals, just life in general, but he's also going to murder men and women, but also children, infants, even the unborn. So watch me now. For like the traditional fundamentalists out there who's holding the abortion signs every weekend and saying, God wants life. It sure didn't seem like God minded taking life then, did he? See, if I start taking this story super literally, I have some really awkward questions I need to address. Because by looking at the story and following the footsteps of this God, then genocide would seem to be a pretty righteous act if I can prove my enemy is evil, right? In my own sight. And also, there's this idea among Christian people that Noah preached and warned the people, like, there's going to be a flood, you better watch out. But here's the reality. If you actually read the story, you won't find that anywhere in these chapters. So essentially, God murders 99.99% of the earth, and he doesn't even warn them? He doesn't even give them a chance? Is this getting hard for you to swallow yet? And then think about all this. There are all kinds of scientific issues with fossils and fossil sequence and overturned strata and just simple questions like, how do all these species exist on that ark, that size of an ark? How do they all somehow get on there? And where does all the poop go? Like, how does this work logically, rationally? How does this actually literally work? And there's also this weird idea of like clean and unclean animals that come up and when entering the ark, and it's kind of weird because according to scripture, this idea of clean and unclean animals, it doesn't actually come into the picture until 3 books later in Leviticus. So we're told Noah and the fam bam and all these species of animals, they exist on the ark for 150 days, and then the water somehow disappears. That much water in less than 5 months. And then they go on and they repopulate the world. So this story, again, if we're going to be honest, it has some obvious problems when you take it literally. So what do we do? I would argue again, we look for the meaning of this ancient story. So I want you to consider some things. Israel's neighbors, they all had flood stories. And the flood story is compiled, and many believe it's written from oral tellings after the older empires of Assyria, Babylon, and others. It actually looks a lot like their stories. So most archaeologists, they believe that there was some sort of flooding that took place around 2900 BC in the ancient Near East. It's not a worldwide flood, but there was some flooding. And so here's how maybe we can begin. The ancients, first of all, they're not asking the question of how did this happen. That's just not the questions they were asking. The real question they're asking is why? Kind of like any of us do in a catastrophe. Why did this happen? Why us? So for people during this time period, you have to understand that the whole earth was not some blue marble moving through this expansive universe like we know it to be inside this tiny galaxy of a universe with all these other galaxies. The whole earth was flat, again, according to them, and it consisted of what you saw in front of you. That was the world. So if you place yourself in that culture, in that time period, the flood story, it actually begins to make sense if you understand it from their perspective. Again, they watched as the rains came down, the rivers rose. They watched as people died, and the known world around them, it's covered in water. They didn't understand features like volume, spatial distribution, intensity, and duration of rainfall, the capacity of water runoff, the need for ground cover, tidal influences. They did not get any of that. They asked why. Why is this happening? And science, yes, helps us with the hows and the whats, but the why, those aren't always so easy, are they? Ever have these moments of why? You've tried answering it with phrases like, well, maybe God has a bigger plan. Maybe she died for a reason, maybe she's in heaven soon enough. I got to be honest with you, those, even saying them, it kind of turns my stomach. Because if we're going to be honest, those answers, they're absolute cop-outs. And they leave us devastatingly dissatisfied. Those answers are cop-outs. And let's just be honest about that. When I was in middle school, I had a friend named Rachel. And we were super close. And I have to be honest with you, just telling the story is still hard. I'm almost 37 years old, and it's still difficult for me to tell the story. Rachel, she was not my girlfriend, but an actual friend. And I didn't have many friends then. I really didn't. I was a socially awkward kid. I got picked on all the time. But Rachel, she kind of took me under her wing and became my friend. And she became someone I could actually talk to, I laughed with. I hung out at her house constantly. I was always stealing all of her cereal. Her parents actually bought special cereal just for me. We weren't romantic because she was more like this sister to me. And so I remember one day my mom, it was in the morning, mid-morning, my mom, she handed me the phone. And she kind of had this concerned look on her face. And she said it was Rachel's mom. And I answered it, and I heard that familiar voice. Yet there was something a little bit different about it. It actually sounded kind of strained. And she said, "Tony, we love you, and we wanted to be the first to tell you." And I remember her voice just kind of trailing off and breaking. And then her husband, he got on a few seconds later, and again, those seconds, they felt like eternity. And her husband, he said, "Tony, Tony, Rachel was hit by a car this morning, and we're at the hospital, and it doesn't seem like she's gonna make it." And again, I was so young. I had never experienced death before, and I can't even tell you like how the conversation ended with him. I just remember falling to the floor, and the question of why was all I could think about. Why? Why did this happen? Why would God allow my friend Rachel to be hit by this drunk driver at 11 a.m. in the morning? Why? How do you answer these questions? The why questions? For the ancient writers, they answered this why differently than many of us. And these flood stories were written in an Akkadian, which is like the great uncle of the Hebrew language, and it was spoken by the Babylonians and the Assyrians, which again, this is a much older tribe than Israel. And so they had their flood stories that actually date further back than Israel's. And so let me share with you two different stories that are really similar to the biblical one. Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was actually one of the first ones that you can find. And here's what was going on. Here's why a flood. Again, they answered the why. They felt that the gods were frustrated because mankind was making too much noise, and they needed to silence mankind. And so, fortunately for mankind, there's some people who escape the wrath of the gods because they build a boat. Interesting, right? And then there's this other story, Atrasis, and this is, again, their answer to the flood story, the Assyrian one. Gods, they punish the world, but they save this one figure. And it's all because this figure builds a boat and places animals inside. And so, again, you can see, again, all these very obvious similarities. But there are some differences, and this is what I find really fascinating. In Genesis 6, 1 through 4, it says the sons of God, they were having relations with women. And so basically they were crisscrossing the divine and the human, which was a pretty common feature in the ancient understandings. And you can even kind of look at the Greeks and the Romans. This is how they were constantly understanding the gods. The gods would come down, they'd impregnate these various women and have these relations with men, and the demigods, it was all kind of causing all of this drama. So these stories show the gods are taking advantage of mankind. But for the Hebrews, they're beginning to see the world differently, and the way they're viewing their God is different. So the Hebrew God doesn't seem to view the world and life as this elevator system where gods go up and down, taking advantage of mankind, getting rid of them altogether. It's really interesting. Verses 1 through 4, it tells us that to them, their God, this up and down violation, chaos, all of that, it's actually a violation of how this God created what life should be like. This God seems to see humanity going the wrong direction, sees the disregard of man, who's unable to see the good in one another, and basically the world around them. He sees all of this and is unhappy. So understand, for this ancient culture, they're beginning to understand that maybe there could be a better world. Maybe it didn't have to be so violent. Maybe it didn't have to be so chaotic. And so understand this, for many of us, we disagree with how they attributed all of this to the gods. But look at what this ancient warring nomadic tribe is understanding about mankind. Again, the killing, the destruction, the pain, it's not what actually brings life. So for them, what happens when things get bad enough, there's this kind of like divine do-over. The God gets angry and sends punishments. And that's how they answer the why. And really, this isn't new to us anymore, because you and I, we've looked at Genesis 1 and 2 together, haven't we? We've looked at the same idea. Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 describes the deep, chaotic mass of water. It's actually the same words used for the flood description. Genesis 2, God divides the waters above and below, same language. Genesis 7:11, chaos is introduced once more, and then mankind chooses chaotic waters. And then it ends with this flood story. God brings everything back to order again. He clears the table, sets it up again. And so look at the deeper meaning here. How many times have you and I gone the wrong direction and ended up in brokenness? How many times have we suffered from the consequences of our own decisions that brought so much chaos? Or worse yet, how many floods have you experienced? Like, I'm talking about how many troubles have you experienced that you weren't the cause. And yet now there are all these consequences you have to deal with, and you weren't even the cause of them. Do we attribute to God? Am I being punished by this divine being because I've been bad, or worse yet, he's got some lesson he needs to teach me? Because God gives free will to everyone to make a lesson out of us? Come on. Did Rachel have her life taken away because she wasn't good enough, or God needed to teach me this ugly lesson? I mean, honestly, that can't be. Like, that is so ugly. I think we can move beyond the ancients' understanding of how the world works. And I think today we can see a bigger picture. Sometimes terrible things happen, and it's life. Plain and simple. There's that phrase, shit happens. And I think, yeah, that's probably one of the best descriptions of it. It's shit. It's terrible. And to say it's anything but, I mean, it's just dishonest. Plain and simple, terrible things happen. And sometimes we're the cause of our own pain. And sometimes others are the cause. But here's the reality. You and I are responsible for our current situation. We control ourselves. We control the present. Other people may be at fault for causing some of our problems, but let's be honest. The waters that are drowning you and me, only you and I are responsible for what we do. The way we look at them, how we address them, how we handle them is entirely up to us. And like the ancients believed about their God resetting everything to create new space, you and I, we can actually do the same. And when we're faced with terrible experiences, either brought on by ourselves, others, a stupid drunk driver killing my friend at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, or even nature itself, sometimes we have to learn to clear the clutter and start again. We look at the choices we have in front of us, and we do like one of my favorite quotes from Shawshank Redemption. You either get busy living or you get busy dying. I would argue we get busy living. And when we do this, we experience rebuilding. And this is actually the idea behind the bow. It wasn't a literal rainbow. The word actually means a bow, a weapon. And it's a weapon in the sky. And so they believed their God was done warring with them. He hung up his weapon. And they believed that after the resetting of things, there should be times of peace. And I think for any of us, we can get on board with that. How many of us need peace right now? After we begin addressing the problems, we work toward peace, repair, restoration. After we take the time to grieve, we can then start again. That morning, after I dropped the phone and I sat there with the why, I felt these two hands on my back, two warm hands that just kind of rubbed my back. It was my mom. And this simple phrase, she said, it will stick with me forever. She said, "We're going to get through this, Tony. We're going to get through this." And for you, my friends, who are facing terrible floods, either by your own choosing, I have this for you. You're going to get through this. You're going to get through it. And for you who have been the victim of someone else's choices, you are going to get through this. You're going to get through it. You're going to get through it. Thank you again for joining me this week, and I hope to see you next week.